Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone. Welcome back to MÜİSEF series of seminars. Today we have a distinguished guest lecturer from Lund University, Associate Professor Dr. Sami al-Daghistani, and today's lecture will be about Islamic economic thought, the entrenchment of modernity. So in a nutshell, I will try to present Dr. Sami. He is an senior associate professor in contemporary Islamic studies at the Center for Theology and Religious Studies, and a researcher at the Center for Advanced Middle Eastern Studies at Lund University, and an associate faculty member at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and research scholar at the Middle East Institute at Columbia University in New York, both since 2019. He wrote several papers and books. I will name few. So he is the author of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali Ethical Teachings, Economics of Happiness, and the award-winning The Making of Islamic Economic Thought, Islamization Law, and Moral Discourse. Also co-editor of Pluralism in Emergences in the Middle East and North Africa, and the editor of Recovering Environmental and Economic Traditions in the Islamic World. Thank you, Dr. Sami, for being here with us today. And thank you for coming again, and the mic is yours, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this kind introduction and for the invitation, Dr. Amal, as well. Thank you for all being here. I'm very pleased to present parts of my ongoing work with you all this afternoon. And before I start, a few minor remarks. One is that I should point out, as I did during the PhD session as well, that I'm an intellectual historian of Islam, working primarily on ethics and economic thought, and not necessarily on finance and banking. And I think this will be visible in how I approach some of the economic questions at hand as well. Having said that, I also believe that economic ideas emerge out of social systems, and as such also that are embedded within historical moments, right? Within cultural, social, historical moments and frameworks. So in the modern era, concepts that are related to economic theory, and financial markets in particular as well, they are linked to particular reality. And that reality is obviously whereby economic provisions are made to be objectives themselves. And I think this is highly problematic, especially if you come from an intellectual Islamic tradition or perspective. So I will start with a few points, and I have also a few slides on the screen as well. Few points on modern Islamic economics before I delve into the pre-modern or classical period and the idea of economic ethics in Islamic tradition. And finally, I will offer some critical remarks on a new hermeneutical reading of Islamic economics and ethical reasoning. Now, economic ethics is in brief based on principles, one could state, that guide responsible commerce, that guide responsible business as well, across different areas. It considers obviously diverse cultural, legal, economic, obviously, landscape. In this context, globalization presents challenges, but also opportunities, specifically for Islamic ethics and business ethics more specifically. Business ethics or economic ethics in a globalized world is obviously a very complex and multifaceted issue as well. And by understanding these ethical challenges and also embracing, on the other hand, ethical principles, I think it can build trust, it can enhance its reputation, it can also contribute to a more sustainable and inclusive global environment. But we should also not forget the elephant in the room, so to speak, which is neoliberal capitalism. The question, I think, for all of us doing work or research on Islamic economics, be it modern or pre-modern, is does economic ethics in Islam undergird or challenge capitalism and its operations? And before delving into this issue, I would like to provide a brief picture of the development and also the history of Islamic economics as a modern subject. Now, Islamic economics established itself, and this is one of my sort of key arguments and claims, within the parameters of knowledge from 1918 but also 19th century Europe. It presented itself as an alternative economic system to both capitalism and socialism. At the same time, it also turned towards economic positivism. We discussed that very briefly during the PhD session as well. Such theories, in my opinion, disregard not only the scholarship of the pre-modern period, but also what I would call the epistemic value of pre-modern economic thought, right? And their ideas on moral economic behavior. This eventually led to coupling of Islamic economics and finance with, to an extent, and we will discuss what exactly this extent is, mainstream economic framework, which paid only lip service then to Sharia and its legal impediments or legal requirements. So the inner structure of Islamic economics, despite its distinctly religious jargon, if you will, is in part based on preconceived economic paradigms, preconceived economic concepts, and notions as well. And I think this is very important for us, but also highly problematic for the whole field in and of itself. Now, there are four groups of scholars who work on Islamic economics, at least the way that I grouped them or divided them. The first group consists of Muslim economists and scholars who believe that Islam presents an alternative to both capitalism and socialism. They favor, obviously, existing, to alter the existing economic models. They often invoke studies that deal with both economic thought, but also the legal tradition, from tafsir, from exegesis of the Quran, to fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, if you will. But as we established before, the methodology of fiqh is different from the methodology of economic science as well, right? We have to keep that in mind. The second group comprises of scholars who believe that Islamic economics is a distinct subject matter or science. However, it's not ready to present itself to the world, so to speak. And some of the scholars in this camp would be Timur Kuran, whom you probably know very well, but also Sayyid Reza Vali Nasser, who is not an economist by training per se, right? Their writings from the 80s and the 90s specifically. For the third group, there is no difference between Islamic economics and capitalist economics. And one scholar that comes to mind is Benedict Köhler. Maybe you've read of his book as well, right? Benedict Köhler, who proposed the idea that Islam in and of itself created a very rudimental idea of a capitalist system. So therefore, the two are very much aligned, right? So keep these sort of different scholars in mind as we move forward. And the fourth and final group elaborates on economic questions, but from the perspective of the ethical self. The ethical self obviously means various different things. We can theorize it or conceptualize it both within adab, so very broadly, a little bit more narrowly within the nafs, even more specifically within the notion of zuhd as renunciation and kasb, acquisition of wealth. And I'm going to come to these questions in the second portion of my talk, whereby focusing on the classical tradition. In my opinion, the fourth group is the least represented within the subject matter, right? So scholars who work on pre-modern classical tradition, they are, I think, the least vocal. They're also the least represented under the umbrella of Islamic economics and finance, right? In relation to that, is obviously Islamic finance and banking, which I think sheds light to some of the ideological features of Islamic economics as a discipline, as a subject. I know this is not specifically my area of expertise, and regardless of the efforts to Islamize both economic mechanisms, economic institutions, but also banking and finance, we know that national economies in Muslim-majority countries, they range from neoliberal global economy to a little bit more sort of socialist economy. It's not only one single unilateral perspective that reigns in these Muslim-majority countries. So we have to keep that in mind when we discuss concepts and mechanisms such as the riba, zakat, and other crucial concepts that I think have been also either neglected or not implemented to the level of changing the reality on the ground in Muslim majority countries, right? So you have a Islamic religious jargon, but you also have predefined science of economics on the other hand as well, right? Two different, at times opposing, but also very much intertwined discourses, if you will. Now, regardless of the efforts to Islamize then these national economies through Islamic tools and mechanisms such as riba or such as zakat and so on and so forth, Islamic governance throughout the Muslim world also inherited the legal frameworks that were bound to economic globalization. And I think this is where part of the problem lies, right? This has obviously repercussion also for Islamic ethics more specifically. So Islamic finance and banking have its origin, on the other hand, also in the institutions and institutional and intellectual frameworks of early Muslim revivalists of the late 19th, early 20th century. There is obviously not a direct lineage between, if you invoke Rashid Rida or Al-Afghani or even Sayyid Qutb and so on and so forth, but obviously a lot of people focus on Maududi, and we know from Islahi in his writings, right, that Maududi, as important as he was as a sort of a within political spectrum, within intellectual spectrum as well, economic spectrum as well, he's not necessarily the first one that defines Islamic economics as a subject or as a system as well, right? There are other scholars from the region, from South Asia, who are laying the groundwork, and Maududi, I think, taps into that and picks from that tradition. But we know the impact of, for instance, Sayyid Qutb onto Maududi, right? And we know the impact and influence of Maududi onto Islamic economics as well. So if there's not direct lineage, there are indirect influences between the early revivalists, if you will, and then later on Muslim ideologues and specifically Muslim economists in the early 20th century. The emergence of Islamic states, for instance, Pakistan, 1979, Iran as well, and other countries, meant also creating social and economic mechanisms that would be fashioned around main Islamic principles. Zakat and riba might be two, but there are actually many other tools as well, financial tools. What happens in the 70s and then onwards, 90s as well, 80s and 90s, you have an emergence of Islamic, both economic and financial institutions and organizations, such as the Organization of Islamic Conference, Islamic Development Bank in 75. You have the International Center for Research in Islamic Economics in 77. You have International Islamic University in Islamabad in the 80s, and then in Malaysia, that was in Pakistan, Lahore. You have in Malaysia in 83, and so on and so forth, right? The Research Institute and Training in 81, but also the IIIT, the International Islamic Institute in Herndon, Virginia. And I'm mentioning, for instance, also the IIIT because of its importance, not necessarily when it comes to economics and finance per se, but Islamization of knowledge efforts, right? So Herndon here, I think, is crucial. Ismail al-Farouqi is crucial, in addition to scholars such as Muhammad Aqib al-Atas. So all of these different institutions and economic centers, financial centers as well, they participated in their own ways, in their own efforts to quote-unquote Islamize or Islamicize educational and economic processes. And they also established financial institutions. So gradually, you have economic teachings that were transformed into concrete financial centers throughout the Middle East and North Africa, but also South and Southeast Asia. And some of those would include, for instance, the Mid-Ghamar Saving Bank in Egypt, already in 63, the Dubai Islamic Bank in 75, the Kuwait Finance Bank in 79, Iran's Islamic Bank, obviously 79, and then you have a group of Faisal banks in 70s and the 80s as well. More specifically, in 1975, the Dubai Islamic Bank, for instance, offers Sharia compliant financial mechanisms and also home offers. And then the very next year, you had the first international conference on Islamic economics that took place in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. I'm mentioning this in a very linear fashion, and purposefully so, because there is obviously a problem with such linear understanding of the development of Islamic economics and finance. And there is obviously a caveat. The proponents of Islamic finance and banking specifically, who, at least in theory, fought against capitalism and socialism a few decades ago, so to speak, they, not necessarily overnight, but gradually, they embrace, I wouldn't call it right-wing, but to an extent, right-leaning financial models to further their imprint in the globalized market. More specifically, they became more pragmatic. They relied on ideological views on right-wing economists, on right-wing leaders, both Muslim and non-Muslim, who were in favor of free market economy. For instance, the adherents of the Chicago School, right, of economics. One simple and very quick example is the government of Sudan, for instance, pursued neoliberal economic outlook in the 80s and also in the 90s, which I think gave, unfortunately, an impression that Islam was also historically, a capitalist religion. And this is where I find the crux of the problem, so to speak, whereby we link, on one hand, the development and the historical sort of flourishing of Islamic finance and banking, on one hand, in religious sources and pre-modern sources as well, and we're going to come to that. And on the other hand, that it's tied and intertwined very much with neoliberal economic model. And then this brings me to the very question of economic ethics in Islam. Now, with economic ethics in Islam, I mean the pre-modern tradition. Early Muslim societies were, and this has been very well established, well acquainted with trade. There is no doubt about that. The narrations, for instance, depicting the Prophet Muhammad and several of his companions as well as merchants, they were familiar with Mecca's trading routes. All of this testifies to the Quran's, if you will, favorable approach to commerce, which is absolutely true. There are also several theses and academic circles explaining Islam's occupation with commerce and trading. Some scholars even claim that early Muslim society developed, quote, a rudimental form of market economy by advocating accumulation of capital, a robust system of investments. Other claims that Muslim culture never really developed an institution of corporation, Timur Quran, for instance, and other financial mechanisms. Why? Because of the rigidity of Sharia's law, right? So you have two very different approaches to how to theorize early Islam and nascent Muslim community in relation to trade and commerce. I would argue that both these theses are incorrect because they assume one particular overarching narrative in explaining a very complex, very composite history, economic history as a matter of fact, which spans centuries, right? Be it either accumulation of wealth on one hand or alleged Sharia's rigidity in managing economic affairs on the other hand. Now, more specifically, and this is where not only my expertise, but sort of my interest lies, is the commercial ethics, if you will, or economic thought, more specifically, right? So in the intellectual contributions by certain scholars in Islamic traditions. So when I mention economic teachings, and I often throughout this talk, I will mention economic teachings specifically and purposefully, and that very much includes economic ethics as well, in the classical tradition was very much part and parcel of wider metaphysical considerations. So my work tries to show that these classical scholars, for instance, Al-Shaybani, Al-Muhasibi, Ibn Abil al-Dunya, Al-Isfahani, Al-Ghazali, but also Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, Ibn Khaldun to an extent as well, that they were cognizant, they were aware of these ethical theories that they were discussing, right? These ethical economic theories, they form part and parcel of daily obligations or even religious duties, if you will. So in that sense, these scholars' approaches were very much all-encompassing and therefore what I call cosmological, right? So they entail the spiritual, the material, the ethical, the metaphysical, therefore, right? These figures underwent different forms of training. They lived in different areas and different eras as well, which I think indicates pluralistic, multivalent, right? Legal, socio-political, but also cultural landscape. But at the very least, the complexity of economic thought in pre-modern Islam as well. So due to the lack of time or time constraints as well, I'm gonna, 15 minutes, we're gonna sort of run through some of the major scholars and their ideas, and then hopefully I will provide some concluding remarks on a new reading, a new hermeneutical reading of how to conceptualize economic thought today. So very briefly, for instance, Al-Shaybani in his Kitab al-Kazb, he's alleged to be the first scholar who thought of Kazb on one hand and Zuhd on the other hand, but really as intertwined categories, right? As we know, Zuhd means to renounce the world, right? To renounce nations, exactly, to negate the material life. But on the other hand, he's discussing the notion of Zuhd in relation to Kazb as well. And Kazb is acquisition of wealth, how to earn a livelihood, right? Adi Setia talks about that in his interpretation and in his translation of his book as well. And I'm sort of expanding that argument to include a little bit more of a all-encompassing cosmological understanding of these economic and financial processes as well, right? So ibadah, how one performs oneself, is very much conceptualized in relation to mu'amala. So ibadat go hand in hand with mu'amalat, right? Kazb obviously means acquiring wealth, but by legal means, by lawful legal means. And Al-Shaybani specifies exactly what these means are, right? It corresponds to one's faith as well. And he would, for instance, say that hoarding is illicit or unlawful, that you cannot hoard food or medical supplies, especially in times of war or in times of shortage, right? One simple example. Very quickly, Al-Muhasib as well, an important scholar who wrote on sustenance, he wrote on faqr, on poverty as well. He was a Shafi jurist by training, right? He thoroughly believed that the self needs constant self-examination, and therefore also the very name of Muhasib, right? From Muhasaba, self-examination or observation. And his book also elucidates human behavior, mannerism, so also again, behavior mannerism, in relation to inward ethical values, character traits, in the context of acquiring wealth. So the care of daily obligations is addressed through the notion of prudence, right? Wara, abstinence, zuhd, reliance on the divine, tawakkul, but also introspection, muhasaba, for instance. And he says that one has to engage in praiseworthy economic activities by performing. So think about what these classical scholars are saying in relation to our contemporary understanding of what exactly is iqtisad or economics, right? He says, so praiseworthy economic activities by performing mindfulness, vigilance, remembrance, right, the dhikr, and dedication and closeness, as well as the purification of the heart, taharat al-qulub. So heavy, complex, Sufi, obviously, terms that to a large extent are completely absent from today's discourse on economic thought and finance as well, right?
It's mostly quantified, right?
Absolutely, it's much more...
Optimization,
absolutely.
How we can maximize this.
Exactly, it's the notion, and we can come to that during the Q&A, it's the notion of utility, it's the notion of maximization within the context of famously put Homo economicus as individual self that is trying to maximize utility of a particular subject or good. Just for the sake of time, I might skip Ibn Abi al-Dunya. I'm happy to share these slides with you as well, and I will go to Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. As you know, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali is one of the key figures or forerunner of economic thought in Islam, and I think in order to position his thought within his overall works, a very versatile scholar who works on fiqh, he works on law, he works on theology, ilm al-kalam, he works on philosophy as well. I think we have to read or treat al-Ghazali as a scholar of heterogeneity in the sense that he's navigating these complex fields, right, being trained as a jurist under Imam al-Juwayni. He travels to Baghdad as well. He's employed at the Nizamiya Madrasa. and eventually he turns towards Sufism. But again, Al-Ghazali is a very unlikely Sufi if you compare his works and his thought with other Sufis at the time. Nevertheless, most of his ideas on economic thought are found in the revival of religious sciences, Ihya Ulumuddin, much less in Mizan al-Amal, Criterion of Action, and Nasihat al-Muluk. Nasihat al-Muluk is obviously a specific genre, right? That some of his authorship has been also questioned by scholars such as Patricia Crones and others. What Al-Ghazali is putting forward is obviously that economic idea is part and parcel of, and this is a technical terms, the science of the hereafter, right? It's Ilm Tariq al-Akhirah. So it's a technical term that it's based both on how do you achieve this science of hereafter is through the notion of happiness, through the notion of sa'ada, but it taps into philosophical reasoning, philosophical conceptualization, but also Sufi terminology, Sufi conceptualization. Therefore, Ihya can be positioned partially as being a work in Sufism, but also being work in really intellectual history and in philosophy, right? Even though Al-Ghazali rejects falasifa, he still taps into some of the philosophical conceptualizations. For instance, this Ihya, specifically in relation to economic, covers both practical aspects as well as theoretical aspects. So, ilm al-mu'amala again, but also, as he called it, the science of unveiling, ilm al-mukashafa. A bit more concretely, that it's, these all sort of abstract theoretical background, what does that mean in relation to Al-Ghazali's thought? For instance, a very important question for all of us here, or concept, is the notion of wealth, or mal, or money. Mal, and I would prefer wealth than money. Money is a little bit more sort of specific interpretation of mal, right? Mal became a source of, and tool as well, of exploitative practices in the caliphate during the 12th century, prior as well as afterwards. Despite the emergence of an array of scholarship and works that really tackle economic issues and ethical questions as well. And he says the very objective of trade and commerce is twofold. Either you gain subsistence or immense wealth. And money or wealth is perceived as one of the most important inventions in economic history, in economic affairs, which is for Al-Ghazali both a benefit but also a detriment. So something that can be very positive or something that can be actually very, very negative, depending on one's intentions and obligations, right? Depending on one's niyyah. So he regards wealth as dangerous in one aspect because it cannot completely satisfy anyone. So the more wealth you have, the more wealth you want, as a matter of fact, because something that he refers to as hubbul mal, right, the love for wealth. But on the other hand, it can also provide certain benefits that are both related to practice, to body, but also to material self, right? So for instance, he says, quote, wealth is the biggest temptation of them all. But then, in the very next sentence, he says, but the worldly wealth is also good for a good man, meaning for a good human being, depending on how it's utilized, right? Regardless of that, wealth is only a means to achieve higher ends, is never an end in and of itself, right? Or a medium of exchange. So the fact that many perceive wealth as having value is because we as a society, quote unquote, democratically decided that money has value, right? We attach value to paper notes, so to speak, right? And he even stated that profit making, for instance, is perceived as a religious stipulation. So again, making profit, being engaged in commerce, being engaged in business is actually a praiseworthy activity. Yet extravagance would be regarded as unlawful or as illicit. There are many more economic activities and examples that could be pointed out, and perhaps we can come to some of them during the Q&A. There's a whole list, for instance, of examples of financial activities that deal with honesty in trading, monopolizing market and market forces as well, how a seller should act, how a buyer should act, right? To whom are you actually able to sell, and in what capacity as well? And he also discusses the very notion of fraud, hoarding of food supplies and medicine, for instance, and also touches upon specialization of labor, so division of labor, at least to minimal extent. But simply due to time constraints, I will jump to conclusion, and then hopefully we can have somewhat larger discussion based on your questions as well. Now, what is presented today as Islamic economics, or specifically economic ethics, is, one could argue, a set of ethical theories, really, that often relate to modern economic science and also modern concepts, right? And I think we have to be, us working in this field, broadly speaking, we have to be aware of that. In that sense, Islamic economics as a modern project, it has drawn on abstract models of economic development, sometimes also disconnected from real-time Muslim societies. Although it appears as an alternative system to the discourse of modernity, according to its textual but also religious sources, if you think of the Quran, the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, and so on and so forth, arguably it still follows, at least in part, neoclassical economics. While, as we well know, national economies in the Arab world or in the Muslim world, they range from centralized socialists all the way to free market. So in theory, anti-Western, anti-capitalist, but also anti-materialist Islamic economic philosophy was co-opted by the very narrative it allegedly fought against several decades ago. What is missing is refashioning or restructuring of a worldview, right? Because economic ideas do not flourish independently from other social, cultural, broader historical structures in which they're embedded. Also, contemporary Islamic economic ethics must reach beyond neoliberal capitalism. And I think it's rarely critically contextualized, and this is actually a question for all of us, it's rarely critically contextualized both within the discipline of humanities, but also more specifically within the discipline of Islamic studies, right? So the fact that Muslim intellectuals had to adopt to existing economic ideas, I think obliged them to engage with the discipline of economics itself, which was not of their own making, right? So this, again, does not mean that one is better than the other, but rather to point to the fact that there are different methodological and epistemological issues that I think we have to be aware of when dealing with the subject matter. Now, given that I would like to leave some time for Q&A, at this point I would like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments you might have.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this incredibly valuable lecture, Dr. Sami, especially the categorization of the literature that you did and mentioned at the beginning. It's really helpful for novice researchers in this field, but also we noticed that the discussion is rich within this field, but still from a historical perspective, there is so much work to be done yet. And also the last thing you mentioned about, like, there is no system better than the other, but we need also to take into consideration the emergence of these systems and their embeddedness in the social and cultural environment. So now we open the Q&A session. So please, if you are following us through YouTube, leave your question in the comment section. And we start with our students, PhD, master scholars in here. Yeah, Hojam, please, Abdulkadir Hojam.
They have a question?
Do you want me to start with the students?
It doesn't matter.
It's okay, Hojam, but you can start. Yeah, of course.
Professor, thanks so much for your beautiful, fruitful presentation. In my opinion, there's a missing points in this approach, and we consider early period of Islam and then jump into the 20th century, and there's a gap, a great gap.
Hopefully not the Schumpeterian gap.
Yeah, I mean, a kind of sort of Schumpeterian approach, but, and just giving an example, Ottoman periods, and modernization of Egypt, Tunisia, there are some figures to have some studies on these issues, challenging the modernity among Muslim societies. And for example, Ahmet Cevdet Pasha had some points of economic modernization, Ahmet Mithat Efendi also, and Hayrettin Pasha, Tunisian Hayrettin Pasha also. And there are lots of things in the context of theoretical side and also practical side, because they challenge with this modernity, okay? They considered about the modern institutions such as banking, insurance companies, taxing maybe, and also we had a study area called İlmu Tedbiril Menzil, for example, Tedbiril Menzil. And if we include that kind of information in this approach, I think it would be more inclusive. That's what I wanted to
Absolutely.
add. And thank you so much again for
Thank
your
you.
fruitful and insightful
Thank you so much.
presentation.
May I briefly respond
Yeah,
before
of
we pick
course.
up different questions? Thank you so much, Professor. I appreciate your comment as well. I 100% agree. If I were, once is lack of time obviously, and second, if I were to specialize on economic thought in the Ottoman period, which you yourself know very well, I would have very much included. When I say pre-modern classical tradition, I mean the whole stretch of it, not only within the context of Islamic law or fiqh, right, which we usually call the formative period in Islam, the 10th, for instance, century or 11th century. Pre-modern economic thought would include, in my books, so to speak, from 8th to 17th, 18th century, right? And absolutely, we gloss over this tradition, either wholesale or in part. Depending on the sources that we're dealing with, depending on the usage of different language as well, I think this opens up door for different methodological and epistemological approaches. So if we were to be extremely inclusive, this would maintain classical, so early classical, 7th, 8th, 9th century, Al-Shaybani onwards, all the way through the formative period, through Al-Ghazali as sort of the pinnacle, but also including other scholars. Ibn Khaldun has been obviously already, I don't want to say that Western scholars have capitalized on Ibn Khaldun, but there is a lot of Ibn Khaldun's thought that has been omitted as well, right? He's always perceived as the forefather of sociology in the West as well, because again, this is a discipline that has to do with early modern Europe as well, right? But if you think of Ibn Khaldun and his approach and ideas on tasawwuf, on Sufism, and other sciences, including ilm umran, absolutely, but also magic and other disciplines and sciences and concepts, I think there is a lot of neglect there, right? But all the way to Al-Tumurtashi, 16th century, absolutely including the Ottoman era, which is extremely rich when it comes to both economic thought but also financial inclusion, mechanisms, concepts, tools, and so on and so forth.
There are some practices also.
Of course. So if we were to write a comprehensive history that deals also with economic thought, so in the intellectual contributions, that would very much entail the Ottoman period. There is no way around it. But for that, we need expertise, right? And I think we need to be cognizant of what sort of our limitations as individual scholars are, and where we reach out to other colleagues in the field, so to speak, or across different disciplines, to think a little bit more comprehensively and critically of how to devise that which we call Islamic economic or even conceptual history, right? So absolutely, very much welcome.
Yeah, and maybe we need more dynamic academic communication when it comes to this, because sometimes, unfortunately, so I said, like, maybe we need more dynamic academic discussion when it comes to the subject of economic history, because generally in the global south, there is like this group of countries speaking only in French, this only group of people speaking in Arabic, this group of people speaking in Urdu, the other one in Bahasa. So we need to kind of break that language, that educational system kind of borders and try to come up with like really valuable discussion to come up with something new, like will benefit everyone. I think there is a lack when it comes to this.
There's a huge language barrier, and also there's a huge Turkish literature actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, including these topics, but yes, there is a huge language barrier, and we have to get together.
Yeah.
Like,
And more often than not, we use another colonial language, which is English, which, as a matter of fact, is also the official language of modern Islamic economics and finance, which, again, in and of itself is not unproblematic, right? So we have to be aware of the foundations, so to speak, and that's why I'm interested to see. Okay, we are in this, utilizing terms as iqtisad, as already mentioned. Yeah. But then if we go back
but the text is in English.
But the text is in English,
ironic,
right? Or if we go back to, let's say, what Al-Shaybani or other scholars said about the very notion of iqtisad, might be actually quite different, right? Yeah. It's a different conceptual understanding of how broad the term is. Yes. How much is actually rooted in what I would call, again, a metaphysical, ethical understanding of its activities as well. And it has little to do with the very contemporary reading of economics to begin with. So it's important not to say one is better than the other, one is more legitimate than the other. It's being aware of the limitations in different methods and epistemologies that we're dealing with. Yeah. I think this goes for Islamic economics specifically, but also Islamic studies more generally as well.
Absolutely. So we need both to navigate languages, and because certainly you cannot do Islamic economics if you don't know at least the bare minimum for Arabic, right? You need to do some readings, but also to navigate the literature, both modern and pre-modern. So it's a challenge, but I think if people learn how to collaborate together, it will be much easier. Okay, so yes, Hocam, please.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Actually, it is glad for us to see you here.
Thank you.
Actually, I mean, I also, read your work several times actually. So, and I think that it is very crucial and valuable to bring the classical scholarship, not only with its legal predicatements, but also, the moral, parts to our age, and establish the Islamic economics on the basis of such heritage. It is very important. I respect this position, and I also share this one. But here, I just thought that there is an unpleasant question or, problem, I guess, which is, how can we, bring it to our time in a way that it does not, delimitate it, actually, in terms of its original structure. Although we cannot assert that, it hasn't been brought, because in terms of legal, arguments or at least evaluations, there is a rich heritage also today. When you just go over the fatwa, you almost actually see that most of these scholars' names are there. So they are frequently cited or referred. But actually, the thing is that Islamic economics, as you mentioned, as a modern phenomenon or discourse, it just lacks from, or not totally but partially, the moral self, or the moral character of those institutions, and also some of the behavioral structure. Actually, I just give an example. For example, for zakah, It just actually was taken as a tax in modern sense. Of course, there are some discussions in classical scholarship as well, whether it is an ibadah or, mu'na, which is a clear and we can say, somehow a category for tax. But actually, in today's world, when you just actually brought this discussion in Islamic economics literature, you can see that the moral side of the subject matter is not there. It is missing somehow. So, because of that reason, actually, I want to say that it seems like that, although we are trying to adapt the institutional structure in the classical times, and also some concepts, there are some missing points. Actually, so this construction has missed some important elements, and also in addition to your four classification of scholars on Islamic economics, actually, also there are some other classifications like the one, for example, that was made by Professor Muzirkaf, as you know as well.
Yeah.
So he made two, I can say, wide categories of scholars. One of them is actually specializes on the normative aspects of the Islamic economics, and how can we, for example, we should be distant from the methodology of economics, because it just actually make us distant from our tradition. And the other one, who is more adaptive, that actually we can, you mentioned the Islamization of knowledge, like these actually mindset. So my question is that, okay, the ethical and behavioral framework is clear in classical scholarship, but how should be the institutional structure designed in the context of today's world for Islamic economics? Because okay, institutions also there, but actually, as you mentioned, there is a moral actually foundation. But when we just trap these institutions with they are just legal parts, or other kinds of features, I guess. There are some missing points. This is my first question, and my second question is that do you believe actually Islamic economics, in the sense that it is rooted in the classical time, can be applied in a nation-state setting? Also, these are my questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you for your comment and also for these two questions. I think they're very, very important and very relevant as well. Thank you. To your, my answer will be twofold. One, you're right that there is a dominance of technical, legal aspects, features, interpretations, and also applications of tools, mechanisms, and what I would generally call Islamic economic project, right? So there is a technical, legal understanding of what Islamic economics is in the modern period. Analyzing this in light of the pre-modern tradition, it's very difficult to discern the moral from the legal, right? It brings us back to that question of where does law end and where does morality or ethics really start? And I think the two would be intertwined. You find that in the classical scholarship, you find that in other theoretical literature on Islamic studies as well. So one is to say we have to think of law, we have to theorize law as moral already. Sharia is a moral law, if you think about it, right? There is no clear distinction between the law, the legality of the law, and the morality of the law, so to speak, right? So if we think of Sharia as a divine, immutable law, the legal is part and parcel of the moral, so to speak, right? It's very difficult to make one decision that is only legal in nature but not ethical already, right? And we can see how this is actually played out in other juristic or legal systems as well. I think it presents a certain challenge when it's theorized within a modern nation state, for instance. In relation to that, that means that the classical scholarship, that would include very much the Ottoman period and beyond, it should not be only a quote-unquote museum studies, that it's only there in books, so to speak, right? I think it's meant to be theorized, but it's also meant to be picked up. It's meant to be, as you sort of questioned very, very accurately, it's meant to have an application. How do we do that, right? Where do we start? There are various approaches to that question. One could be simply, well, let's start by reading. Very simple. Let's start by reading the classical tradition. And I think that our educational, institutional sort of centers and institutes as well could be a perfect breeding ground for such exercises as well, right? You start by having seminars. You start by actually devising reading lists. You start by actually slipping in, a book here, a book there, an article here, an article there, into the already established curricula, reading list requirements, courses, course literature, and so on and so forth. So you start by reading. Second, then you discuss that with your colleagues and peers and professors and senior and junior scholars as well. And third is the question of application, proper application. We know that there are scholars, for instance, Al-Ghazali as well, and he's very big in Indonesia as well, and Al-Ghazali's idea on pedagogy, Al-Ghazali's idea on ethics of education, Al-Ghazali's ideas on this and that as well, right? I think something similar could be enforced, if you will, when it comes to economic thought. So collecting an array of scholarship and scholars as well, from various genres, various books, and you see, but wait, hold on, they're not only talking about the theoretical aspect. I mean, even Al-Ghazali talks as ilm al-mu'amala, but also ilm al-mukashafa, right? Al-Shaybani talks about kazb, but also zuhd, right? So there is the theoretical side of things, and there is the practical material side of things. And this brings us back to the very question of economics. It's meant to be both a theoretical and a practical science. So I think the application of such theories, it's really inevitable. The question is only for us, for our institutes, for institutions, for our curricula, how do we start devising that? Because there is a great amount to be learned from this scholarship and these particular thinkers as well, right? When it comes to, let's say, barter exchange, I mean, a lot of these thinkers, even though they're normative in their approach, they're also very systematic. They discuss how to engage in selling, how to engage in buying, what is really the several aspects of commerce, how to engage in quote-unquote righteous trading activities as well. If we're talking about Islamic finance as already established system, how come we cannot link some of our activities to the scholarship that predates us? Right? And this is, again, I think one of the dangers is that we talk about Islamic economics and finance as a modern subject and discipline, that it's rooted in philosophical structures of modernity, as a matter of fact. And then we gloss over the whole tradition, but then we come to the religious sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, right? And therefore we call it Islamic science or Islamic economics or Islamic finance, right? So I find that highly problematic, right? We gloss over the centuries of contributions, right? And I think our, not task necessarily, but one way of revising this would be to extrapolate the important points made by these various scholars, because you will never find a book that deals only with economic issues in the pre-modern period, right? I mean, they're dealing with an array of sources, from law to fatwa, if it's a little bit more legal literature, to adab. Adab is extremely important, adab and tasawwuf as well, akhlaq as ethics. So it's dispersed, but it's very systematized, right? These scholars, despite their normative approach, they have a very systematic approach to economic and financial issues, right? And then there was your final point on the applicability within the modern nation state. I mean, this, on one hand, extremely important. It's a million-dollar question. On the other hand, I think there is no application of Islamic economics through this critical, inclusive, plural approach within a modern nation state. Modern nation state is tied to neoliberal capitalism. If we were to implement it, I think we have to envision a different economic system altogether. I don't think it can be a successful application within an existing modern nation state as it is now. It's tied to global modernity. It's tied to neoliberal capitalism as well. And I think this is exactly what happened, to be very critical of Islamic finance as well. It became a niche, a very important niche. It deals with very important mechanisms of zakat and riba and so on and so forth. But it became a niche within the global system.
So we moved from what is supposed to be convergence to dimensions.
At least to an extent. And I'm saying this if the overarching goal of modern Islamic economics and finance is truly to be upheld, which is socioeconomic justice, to put it very, very simply, right? Socioeconomic justice, which is a very broad and important sort of imaginary or concept as well. We can ask ourselves, is our society better or worse? Are particular Muslim countries or institutions or communities better socioeconomically or worse? Right? Is the reduction of poverty successful? If yes, to what extent? If not, to what extent? Right? So we have to ask these very sort of simple questions if we were to.
There is a common ground between Islamic economics and post-Keynesian approach in that.
Yeah.
What you said.
Yeah.
Social justice.
Yes. Yeah, the social justice issue, which I think, if you look at the classical tradition as well, I mean, various these scholars, they would say, but what is the point of quote-unquote righteous economic activities? What is the point of not hoarding wealth in times of need? What is the point of perceiving money as a means to achieve higher ends or as a medium of exchange? It's to secure economic justice at the end of the day. So it's I think it's noble, it's very simple, but it's also practical solutions. And I think if we're not there, then maybe it's Islamic.
We need to ask the question why we are not
at least
there
to begin
yet, despite like decades of research and institutional emergence. So yeah, 100% agree. Maybe sometimes I like have this idea. Sometimes just talk to myself. Like maybe we should start from the smaller groups. Like we start from our families, our communities. Local communities are a thing now in the literature and in the policies.
Yeah.
We start to work on their resilience and enhancement of their social and economic stature. And maybe only after that, when they see some kind of success, like the big guys, by guys I mean institutions, will move forward to make this something really that can happen on the ground. Like, let's adopt this and make it something more useful for the society, independently of the economic output.
I think that's a valid point because if economy, there are two things here. If economy is truly sustainable, then at least in part it has to be local. Even though now we're used to sort of global economy, right?
Yes.
There is no life without globalization today.
Yeah.
We cannot imagine the foods that we're eating, the services we're getting, it's all overnight. It's on a click of a button.
Yeah.
And tomorrow it's delivered to your doorhouse, right? But an economy to be truly sustainable, at least in part, it has to be localized, right?
Yeah.
Second thing, this is where our strength possibly lies as well. You start within, ilm tadbir al-manzil. I mean, you start within at your own doorstep, so to speak. The catch here might be, and I think this deals very much with this ecological, environmental, ethical perspective, as in everything relies on the individual. And you remove the responsibility of global conglomerates, you remove the responsibility for nation states and from governments, and you actually place them onto the individuals, which I think it's a double-edged sword, right? Yes, we're responsible for our own behavior, period, either economic or environmental. It's us readjusting the thermostat, it's us shutting down the water when we don't need it, and so on and so forth. These are crucial moments. But it's not only individuals that are responsible. If you think of sort of emittance of carbon footprint and so on and so forth, the military-industrial complex is,
Yes.
it reaches beyond how many millions of individuals. as
Yes,
well, right?
certainly.
So things that meaning to say these problems are systemic as well.
Yes, of course, we cannot deny that at all. So, any more questions? Yes. Yes.
Professor, thank you very much for coming and for this wonderful lecture. I have two questions, but it seems in your response to the previous questions, it seems you touched on my questions. But anyway, I also ask these questions. The first question I want to know is, you mentioned capitalism during your presentation. You said some scholars argue that Islamic economic history is rooted in capitalism. So I just want to know what their main arguments are about this. And the second question has to do with the current Islamic finance industry.
Yeah.
It's faced a lot of criticisms from scholars, and their reason, one of their main reasons is it's difficult thriving within this circumstance, applying all Sharia standards, or let's say trying to apply all Islamic ethical standards. It's actually very difficult for them to thrive.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, we have scholars that are criticizing them for the very reason they were established. They are not actually going by that. So my question is, how do we find a balance in between these two, the criticisms and what they are also saying? These are my two questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for that. To your first point, I briefly mentioned during the presentation that some scholars claim that there is really no epistemological division between forms of capitalism and early Islamic understanding of wealth accumulation, right? Benedict Koller might be actually one of those scholars. Why? Because they see that if even religious sources such as the Quran advocate for accumulation of capital, profit making is allowed, investments is allowed, and so on and so forth, there is no necessarily institution as corporation, which was established in Europe, early modern Europe as well, right? These allows for some, I would say, relatively dangerous interpretations of seeing Islam being prone to capital accumulation. I would disagree with this thesis specifically, right? Because of the ethical, moral, also legal structures of Islamic law, right? So yes, profit making is allowed, but how do you make profit? That is regulated. What do you do with profit? That is also regulated, right? Maybe there is no cap as to how much can you make. But nevertheless, the wealthier they are, and again, this is the classical scholarship says it as well. Al-Ghazali mentions it, and other scholars as well. The wealthier you are, the more liable you are to your society and members within your society in which you live. Meaning, the more of a responsibility you have to the direct members of society in which you live. Right? So that would go against this thesis of perceiving Islam as prone to very rudimental understanding of capitalism, right? To your second point, where is the balance between criticism and critique? There's a difference between criticism and critique, and admiration or approval or support. I think there's a thin line. There's a thin line between critique and approval when it comes to Islamic economics and finance, from my perspective. Why? Because it deals with different epistemological sources, right? It deals with religious sources that are upheld, but it also deals with predefined economic, financial tools and mechanisms and theories. And again, this is not to say that one belongs to quote-unquote Islamic tradition, the other does not belong to Islamic tradition. We know from Islamic history itself that Islam has always been a culture, a faith, a civilizational approach, if you will, that tapped into various traditions, from Persian to Indian, from the Falasifa were very much aligned with Aristotle's philosophy and so on and so forth. There was no there was no tension necessarily between Aristotle's thought and Quranic revelation for Al-Farabi and Al-Kindi and Ibn Sina and so on and so forth, right? So Islam has always tapped into different cultures and tradition. That is not a problem in and of itself. I think the issue is whether we are aware of the sources of knowledge, whether we affirm different methods in how we approach the subject matter, and then what is exactly is the ultimate game, the ultimate aim of let's say Islamic economics and finance. So, and again, this is a question for all of us. What is the ultimate aim of Islamic finance economics? Is it achieving social justice or not? Is it perhaps something else? I think this is a constant reminder for us to be put there, right? Second, related to that, is there such a thing as quote-unquote an Islamic economy in this world today? And my answer would be no. Economics is different as a field of study or as an approach. But a functioning economy that is purely based on quote-unquote Islamic divisions or sources or epistemology, it does not exist. There is no such thing. And maybe there is no need for such thing to begin with. But again, we have to be aware of different concepts and tools and mechanisms that we're using. Right? I think maybe this is already like half of the solution, so to speak.
Yeah, we only still have like 5 minutes around.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. Actually, when I listened to your talk, in our institute we are also dealing with very similar dialogue between the tradition and the modern. So we put two different in Ibn Haldun University, actually, in Alliance of Civilization Institute, and it's a very tough job to understand an ancient text and bring it today. Itself is a challenge, and of course we should somehow undertake this challenge. But sometimes I'm feeling, this is a question for your scholarship actually. Sometimes I feel as if on the one side we are talking about the modernity, capitalism, as if when you start delving into crisis of climate crisis, for instance, you realize the problem is huge, and it needs extremely drastic change. Humanity is in need, and even in the West, people are lamenting, for instance, like Hein very recently wrote a book, Work in Ruins, for instance. They are all accepting this. We are doomed, they say, in the West even. Yeah. And people are looking for new ways of relating with world and also our other human beings and also our scholarship. Are you suggesting a reconstruction, or are you suggesting a revolution, or are you suggesting a direct normative position coming from Islam, or are you suggesting just a mere description that a genius critique of the existing economics or existing contemporary world, or what's your position, or where should a scholar start in front of this huge problem?
Yeah. Thank you for that question as well. Very quickly as well. It's a big, obviously, question, and it involves, to adequately answer, my answer would be at least threefold. We obviously do not have time for that, but just to summarize it, so to speak. One is, there is no economic system out there that would work for the majority of the inhabitants of the world. So I think we have to make peace with that, whether this is a socialist, capitalist, or quote-unquote Islamic economic system, right? So it will not work for the majority of the people, meaning there will always be some type of misunderstanding, opposition, and so on and so forth. Second, so meaning it's not for everyone, right? Second, I think critique is a very good start, right? My work starts with a critique. It starts with a critique of modern Islamic economic project, and then it delves further down into the pre-modern period, so to speak. But it does not end with critique, right? Critique might be a path towards reconstruction. Reconstruction of a worldview, reconstruction of different tools and mechanisms with which we can adjust our modern lives in this world as well, right? What does reconstruction actually mean? Either by tapping into the pre-modern tradition, I think this could be part of it, that it's very much not only theoretical but also on the side of applicability, or, as I mentioned during the PhD session, the very process of decoloniality as well. I think if we take Islamic economic projects seriously, and I think if we perceive it critically, I think it offers an excellent platform for decoloniality, right? In what sense? Well, because it questions, or it should question, at least in theory, the sources of knowledge, the different methods of being used, the methodologies in which we operate, that can actually extend to both Islamic Muslim majority countries, but also Euro-America, so to speak, right? Dealing with different languages as well, not only English, but Bahasa, Arabic, Turkish, Persian, and so on and so forth. So I see it as a rich repository, as a possible lens of decoloniality that pertains to not only economic and financial mechanisms and questions, but more broadly environmental, because we all know that the economy is part and parcel of the environment. So there is no divorcing the two. If we're serious about addressing the environmental and ecological issues, we have to address economic and financial problems as well, right? And I think this brings us back to the crux of neoliberal capitalism as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sami. It was really a valuable lecture for all of us, students and lecturer. And hopefully we will see you soon again in Istanbul. Maybe Ozan Hoca, he's specialized now in workshops, çalıştay. So maybe we can do something that both connects the moral side of Islamic economics, but also how we can inspire that and aspire from historical experience of Muslims in terms of scholarship, but also like the practices that had been used during the pre-modern time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you really genuinely, even for the session we had before the seminar. And I wish you to see you soon, all of you actually.
Thank you.
And inshallah, see you again in a new seminar, hopefully very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it, and for the invitation.